Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
So with that, we move on to another topic of this chapter, and here now we'll look at Bombay, one of the colonial cities, its segregation, its town planning, and also the architecture. Okay. Now, of course, Bombay is present-day Mumbai in the state of Maharashtra. Okay. Now, Mumbai is named after the goddess Mumba Devi. Alright. Now, Bombay was initially 7 different islands and they were merged together to form the modern day Bombay and then Mumbai. Okay. In 1534, Francis Almeida captured the main islands of Bombay from Bahadur Shah. So Bombay was part of the Mughal Empire and in 1534 it was captured by Francis Almeida. And after its capture, he built a fort at Basseterre. In 1661, King Charles II of England got the island of Bombay as part of dowry when he married a princess from Portugal whose name was Catherine. Now, after that, he then gave it to the English East India Company, alright, on lease. He rented it to the English East India Company. After it came to the hands of English East India Company, it was then that the formation of the modern city of Bombay started. Now, Bombay's first governor was called George Oxenden. Okay, and its second governor was called Gerard Ungier, and it was under this governor, under Ungier's governorship, that the island developed as a center of commercial activities. Okay, now that was the brief background of Bombay. Now let's look at Bombay in the 19th century, in 1800s. After the victory over Maratha in 1870, so the British East India Company was fighting with the Marathas, which were in the adjacent areas of Bombay. Okay, after the victory over the Marathas in 1817, the British started to concentrate in their developmental project in Bombay. Between 1784 to 1845, the 7 islands they were merged together to form one landmass, and that was the modern Bombay, the colonial Bombay. After that, a regular civil administration was put into place, like municipality, corporations, committees, to oversee the proper functioning of the island or the place. And in 1853, a 36-meter long railway line between Thane and Bombay was inaugurated. Okay, and later, soon, first cotton mill was also founded by the British in Bombay. Now, with the railways coming up, with the cotton mills being set up, there was huge number of migrant laborers or Marathi workers who came to the city of Bombay in search of employment. Now, with the outbreak of American Civil War in 1861 and the opening of Suez Canal in 1869, the export of cotton from Bombay increased rapidly. Okay? And the export of cotton and the cotton trade, it was facilitated by the railways that were introduced. Okay? The Great Peninsular Railway, it was called. Now, with the boom of the cotton industry and the cotton trade, the British East India Company or the British government was able to accumulate a huge amount of wealth. Alright? Now, with that, there were a lot of landmarks or a lot of constructions of buildings that Bombay saw during that period. So, many of Bombay's famous landmarks like Flora Fountain, Victoria Terminus Railway Station, Hanging Garden, and the lakes which are found in Bombay, they were built during the 19th century. The Bombay Municipal Corporation was founded by the British government in 1872, and this allowed rebuilding of the core area of the city with the money that the cotton boom was bringing in. So the main money or the main cause for the rebuilding or construction of the modern Bombay, the city of Bombay, was the cotton boom that this period saw. So the huge amount of wealth that the British government was amassing as a result of the cotton boom in Bombay was used for the construction and the development of the city. So that was 19th century Bombay. Now let's look at the 20th century Bombay. Okay. The British and the Parsi merchants left the suburbs and moved to the Malabar Hill. During the 20th century, now the British and Parsi merchants, they went to the little bit outskirt of the city. Okay. The other areas apart from the Malabar Hill was developed for the middle classes, the middle class which was growing as a result of the emergence of the cities. Okay, the City Improvement Trust developed suburbs of Dadar, Mutunga, Wadala and Sion. And this area, the developed area, it housed about 200,000 people, about 2 lakhs people. Okay. New roads were built in Bombay which connected the inner city with the suburbs, the areas lying outside the main city. In 1925, the electrified suburban railways or trains also started to run in the city. The first years of the 20th century, Bombay saw congestion. The inner city of Bombay was extremely congested. It was crowded. And the rest of the Bombay became equally crowded by the 1980s. Okay, the City Improvement Trust, which worked towards the development and expansion of Bombay, it tried to open the areas by building wide roads through the city of Bombay. Okay, so that was the condition of Bombay in the 20th century. Now let's look at the modernization of transport system in Bombay. Now, with the growth of cities, the transport system also had to be developed or it had to be modernized. Okay, so Jamshedji Tata was the first Indian to own a car. When the cars came to be used in India, it was the Jamshedji Tata who was the first owner of the car in India. By 1911, motorized taxis were already starting to be seen in India and already being used by some of the Indians. By July 15th, the first motorized bus ran between Anglican Church and Crawford Market. By 15th of July the same year, okay, the first motorized bus ran. And February of 1925, the trains began to run on the harbour line. Alright. The electrification of trains began at the same time. So the trams also began to be seen and introduced and they began to run around the city. Okay. And there was construction of Imperial Bombay, which continued from the 19th century to the 20th century. So let's look at some of the buildings that were built in the 19th century and continued in the 20th century. They were the Gateway of India, the General Post Office, the Town Hall, which is now called the Asiatic Library, the Prince of Wales Museum, the Institute of Science, the office of the BB and CI Railway, now the Western Railway it's called, and many other buildings. Okay. Apart from the construction of these imperial buildings, Bombay expanded both towards the north as well as towards the south. Okay. Now let's look at the millennial Bombay. Now today, Bombay is India's one of the main port city as well as a center for commerce and trade. Okay. Now the city even today sees increasing poverty, people in poverty, and also at the same time increasing middle class people. Okay. The population increased in the 1950s and 60s, and this was because of the absence of opportunities in the rest of the country, not only in Bombay but as well as in the rest of the country. Bombay today remains one of the most important industrial cities and it contributes to 1/3 of the revenue of the entire country. and the name Bombay was renamed to Mumbai in the mid-90s. Okay, so that is how Bombay is at the present time. Now let us look at the architecture in Bombay, the buildings. Okay, so Bombay saw construction of forts, government offices, educational institutions, religious structures like churches, temples, commemorative towers, commercial depots, insurance centers, etc., even docks and bridges during the colonial rule. Now these were built primarily for defense, for administration, and for commercial activities. Okay, and these buildings, they were built to represent the power of the British government, the imperial power. Okay, so the style of the buildings at Bombay was usually European style. So the way in which the buildings were constructed, the style of it was European style. Now let us look at how these styles, they reflected the imperial vision, the imperial power, the imperial rule. Okay, so there were three main ways in which the architecture reflected the imperial vision, the vision, aim, ambition, power of the British government. So first, that by the styles that the British adopted to build the architecture in Bombay, they wanted to express their desire to develop a familiar landscape in an alien country. So the British had established their control in an alien country which was far away from home, different from home, right? So it was an alien country. Now, in order to make it feel like home, they wanted to build buildings which were built in their home country, in Britain. Okay, so that was number one expression, or that was number one reason for the architecture, the style of architecture that they adopted in Bombay. Number two reason is that the British government realized that European styles of architecture would symbolize their superiority, their authority, and their power over the Indians. Okay, so that was number two reason. And number three reason was that the architecture, the colonial architecture, would clearly demonstrate or show the difference and the distance between the colonial masters and their Indian subjects who they subjugated, who they controlled and ruled over. That was required for them to be legitimized as the ruler, the ultimate, the sole ruler of India and its people. Okay. Now, in the beginning, the Indians preferred traditional Indian buildings. In the beginning, as the British were building European-style buildings in Bombay, the Indians were not so bothered and they preferred to use the traditional Indian style. But they gradually got influenced by the European architecture. Okay? And they used that to in their buildings as well. So when the rich merchants built their houses, they built in the European style of architecture. Okay. Now the British builders sometimes they adopted Indian architectural styles. So what we are trying to understand is that obviously there were reasons why the British government adopted European styles in the architecture. Okay, in India, but not all the time they used the European architectural styles in building imperial buildings in Bombay. Sometimes there was a mix of both European and the Indian styles of architecture. Okay, so whenever and whatever suited their needs, they used and adopted these styles. Alright, so the public buildings were built in three main styles. And two of these styles were styles that were present and that were used in their home country, Britain. Okay. So the first style is called neoclassical or the new classical. That's the style of architecture. Now, what did this style mean? This meant that the buildings would have many geometrical shapes, okay, and had lofty, huge pillars. And the style of this neoclassical was borrowed from the buildings in ancient Rome, okay. Now, the British government, they used this neoclassical style in building the imperial buildings in India because they thought this would express the glory of British imperialism in India. And they also thought that this style was suitable for the hot weather that India experienced, okay, because this kind of style used marbles and it was white in color most of the times, which was suitable for the tropical weather in India. So many buildings that were built in this style, they appeared in the 1860s, and one of them is the Elphinstone Circle. That's one of the examples, and this was later known as Horniman Circle. Okay. Now the second kind of style is called Neo-Gothic style. Alright. Now this style consisted of high-pitched roofs, like very conical and pointed roofs, and it had pointed arches and the detailed decoration used on the outside and inside of the architecture. Okay. Now these kind of style was used mostly when they built churches. Okay. And this kind of style was used in Europe during the medieval period. Alright. So some of the examples of this style in Bombay can be seen from the Secretariat Building, University of Bombay and High Court. Okay. Now, when building these kind of buildings by the British government, not all the time they sponsored the construction. Sometimes wealthy Indian merchants and traders also sponsored some amount of money for the construction of the imperial buildings. Okay. So, if we look at the University of Bombay, the University Hall was built with the money that was donated by a rich Parsi merchant whose name was Sir Chawaz G. Jahangir. And the University Library Clock Tower was built with the money donated by a banker whose name was Premchand Roychand. So, these were Indian merchants who gave some amount of money in the construction projects of the British government. Now, the most spectacular example of this kind of style, which is called Neo-Gothic style in Bombay, is the Victoria Terminus, which is now known as the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus. Okay. Now, apart from these two, Neoclassical and Neo-Gothic, there was another kind of architectural style which developed in India at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, this kind of style was called Indo-Saracenic style. Now, what was Indo-Saracenic style? It was a combination of both Indian and European styles. So, merging the Gothic, Neoclassical style with the existing styles of architecture that was in India. Okay, so the inspiration of this style came from domes, like the one we see in Qutub Minar, in Taj Mahal, etc. The chhatris, the kind of feature in the architecture of Indian buildings which look like umbrella, chhatris. Okay, jalis, which we can see in the buildings in many forts and palaces in Jaipur, in Jodhpur, etc. And arches that were used in the medieval buildings. So these were the inspirations that the style of architecture, Indo-Saracenic, took from the Indian style and merged it with the European style. Okay, so this was used in India by the British so that they can prove that they were legitimate rulers of India. So this was by using this kind of style in building architecture, the British government was trying to make a statement, and that statement was the Indians were under their control. The Indians were their subject and they were the rulers. Alright. So the famous example of Indo-Saracenic style of architecture in Bombay is the Gateway of India. Alright. Now, despite these three important styles of architecture that were present during the colonial rule in India, in Bombay, there were traditional styles of decorations and traditional styles of construction that existed in India, and that continue to remain predominated, that continue to become important, that continue to be used by the natives and others as well. Okay. Now, with the emergence and the development of the city of Bombay, colonial Bombay, there was a shortage of space. We already know the migration of huge number of laborers, merchants, workers that gave rise to space crunch, that gave rise to shortage of space. They did not have proper housing facilities. All right, so people began to live in slum areas. There were emergence of slums and such settlements. All right, so the city developed a unique type of building, and that building was called chawl. Now these chawls were multi-storied building. Okay, and the building had numerous single room apartments with long open corridors and a courtyard built around it. Okay, so there was a courtyard at the center and the building surrounded the courtyard, and the building was multi-storied. It was huge building, but the building had numerous single room apartments. So this building housed several hundreds of families, and they shared common spaces like courtyard, backyard, etc. All right, so these kind of buildings also emerged in Bombay. Now let us look at the importance of the architectural styles. So we learned about the architectural styles, the neoclassical, neo-Gothic, Indo-Saracenic. What is the importance? Why is it important for us to understand these three different kinds of styles? Because by looking at the styles adopted by the rulers, the British rulers, in the construction of their buildings, we understand the ideals, the ideas that was present at that time. Okay, because these buildings, they expressed the vision, the aim, the understanding, the notion of those who built them. So by building certain type of buildings, the rulers are trying to express their ideas, their notions of what they understand themselves as rulers and how the subjects should be understood, the ones who are subjugated by the rulers, right? So through buildings, the rulers try to express their power, not only in one place, not only in one spot, but throughout the area under their control. So by that, when the British built imperial buildings, they were choosing to use specific styles to express what they understood, what the message they wanted to give, and what they wanted the subjects to understand. Okay, how their vision through the structures and the features. All right. So the architectural styles not only express the vision of the ones who ruled them, but also expressed the tastes and the culture. Okay, the culture followed by the rulers as well as followed by those who built them. Okay. So there were many Indians who came to regard European styles of architecture as symbols of modernity and civilization and adopted them. So many Indians liked the European styles of architecture. They considered it to be modern, symbol of modernity, and adopted them. Okay, they were influenced by them. But there were others who rejected it, and they were okay with the Indian or traditional style of architecture prevalent in India. They tried to continue practicing that. Okay, and there were some Indians who took elements of both the styles and combined them. Okay, and formed a new unique style. Okay. So by this, we also understand the different forms of cultural conflicts. We also see how by looking at the buildings and who has built it, we see the conflict between the ones who built it and between the ones who lie outside of it, where it is built. So the conflict between the ones who built it and for whom it is built and why it is built. So that conflict can also be understood by looking at the styles adopted for building for constructing a building. All right.